Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today, I'm talking about how Formula One shifted the dial in its use of insights and analytics and data. I'm super excited to have with me Max Métral. He's the Senior Analytics Manager over at Formula One. So, Max, I would love to welcome you to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason.
No problem at all. So let's get into a little bit about you and your background, and also a little bit about Formula One, what that organization is, what they do and don't do. That'd be great.
Yes. So as you said, I'm Senior Analytics Manager for Formula One. I joined about 4 years ago, just after the takeover by Liberty Media. So we had a change of ownership. And the idea where my role sits is trying to embrace data and insights across the business from a business perspective. Yeah. Obviously, there's a lot of data when it comes to F1 on the car perspective, on the team perspective, and you can see it in both ways. One way is using data to improve the car performance or the sports performance, and that is not my job. And using data to improve the business performance, and that's what I do on the league level. So obviously you have different entities, you have the teams as well. So I'm working on the league level, and the idea is to help across the business, across how F1 generate money and revenue and fan engagement, help all the different departments, marketing, digital, sponsorship, and others, make better decisions with use of data. And I'm sure we'll go through some examples later on.
Brilliant. And your background, I assume, is in kind of data analytics, and you sort of got to this point. Where have you come from? Are you an analyst at heart? Are you from academia? Where's your sort of background?
So I've done business school with like a major in business analytics. So I'm not a data scientist at heart.
Okay.
The way I describe myself, so I was working in sports before. So I was working for City Football Groups in football down in Manchester. So Manchester City, New York City, and other clubs and the like of these. And the way I would describe my job is what people call translators. So there's like a good article in our business review a couple of years ago called "You don't have to be a data scientist to have this must-have analytical job." And it's about the translators, the people within organizations are the in-betweener between the key stakeholders that may not be super data savvy, chief commercial officer and all the super high-level people, and the more data teams. And so trying to understand what the needs are, prioritize, project manage, and also translate the data answers into actionable recommendations and the business problems into data questions as well. So doing both ways. So that's how I describe myself.
Brilliant. No, that's great. I mean, it's less common to have someone from a non-data and analytics and technical background, actually, or one of those three, and coming at it from the way you do. And I like the way you describe this kind of idea that you can just focus on business outcomes, business challenges, and your tool of choice to help do that is analytics and insights, and bringing those things together is great. So cool. Totally get that, and love where you're coming from. In terms of Formula One, so obviously there's the teams themselves who manage the drivers and manage the cars and race the races. What does the Formula One organization look after?
So in terms of entity, we commercialize the rights, which means basically three main key revenue channels. First one being TV rights, so monetizing to the likes of the whole TV channels across the world, 200 plus broadcasters, monetizing the rights. Secondly, you have the promoters. And this is where I think most people may not know this, but we don't organize our own events, we license them. So if you, Jason, end up owning a circuit, you may come to us and ask us, oh, could you guys come? Then you pay us a fee, but in exchange, you're the person organizing the Grand Prix and monetizing the tickets. So funnily enough, we actually don't monetize tickets, or we act as a small reseller, but this is not our main activity. So we license them. So this is what we call promoters, which could be governments, entities, circus holders, private entities, a bit of everything. That's the second one. And the third one being sponsorship. That's so very classic, Purity, Rolex, Heineken, Aramco, and the likes. And finally, the fourth one is a bit of an aggregate, and that's what's actually been much changing over the past few years, is all the direct to consumer. So we've started monetizing content ourselves directly, so not going through our broadcasters, but sending it directly to consumers and fans. What we call F1 TV. It's not available in every country yet, but that's a whole different tool. And from a company who's at core, and that's the like sports as well as B2B, it's kind of starting to embrace direct to consumer, which obviously generates way more data and has more interesting things. So direct to consumer F1 TV, but we also like merchandise, retail, a bit of ticketing, as I said, even though it is quite small. And this is also kind of the fourth pillar, which is aggregating. This, I think, some of the growth come from as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, and that D2C thing's, I guess, new and very interesting, exciting. You get to know the fans a little bit more directly, understand their behaviors, what they do and don't do. And I imagine there's kind of layers of being a fan of Formula One. You're either a fan of sort of Formula One, or you're a fan of a driver, or you're a fan of a team, or you like the merchandise, or you like the idea, or you like cars, or you like racing. Do you know what I mean? There's so many different elements to what it means to be engaged with Formula One racing. And I guess you get to understand that a little bit more now.
Absolutely, there are a lot of things going on. I think one of the key piece of insight that we found is actually knowledge drives fandom. So the more you understand about a sport, especially about F1, which can be complex, the level zero of understanding is whoever crosses the line first wins. That's quite easy. But then as you get a bit deeper, it can get a bit more complex. You have some specific terminology, and also at core of the F1 sport it's a mix between a car and technology race and a driver's race. You always have who will be fastest in whichever car, because Lewis Hamilton is one of the best, if not the best of the best. He's amazing. He's also driving one of the best cars, again, if not one of the best. So it's like, what would Lewis do if he had so and so's car? This is at core, but at the core of fandom is knowledge, and also you have different types of fandom maturity, because at core, F1 is truly international. We've been racing in about 20 plus countries across the world for about 70 years now. And we are across, if not almost all time zones. We go from Asia, Australia, Europe, US, Americas, South America, and so on and so forth. So it's a bit everywhere. So obviously, some countries are more mature in terms of fandom. If you're a Brazilian fan, you've had a race for ages. You had like amazing drivers like Ayrton Senna, Rubens Barrichello, and others. And if some Asian countries, it's more like growing. You may have had a race for a couple of years, or you might live in a country you don't have a race. You don't have maybe yet a driver who's been super famous or super successful. So you have like different types of maturity cycles within different places of the world.
Brilliant. No, really, really interesting. And in terms of the kind of, you obviously got a bit of background in not only Formula One, but other sports over your career. Where is the sports industry in terms of its use of data? I guess the kind of macro level maturity, where the focus has been, and sort of where it's going. Have you got some thoughts, opinions on that?
So at core, based on the first definition I made, like between the sports analytics, using data to improve sports performance on the pitch, on the grass, on the track, and the business one. The sports one is really what's the first thing. And this has been popularized by the likes of Moneyball, which was a book published by Michael Lewis in 2002, if I believe. And then a movie with Brad Pitt and Sons, maybe what made it famous. And that's really what started the snowball effect in terms of using data on the sports perspective. Baseball obviously being very quite easy to analyze, super individual, even though it's team sport, you can single out some single performances and try and make analysis. When it comes to team sports, it's way more complex. You have some intricacies into the data analysis, but that's really the core thing. So for every entity and organization, which financial results are based on the sporting results. So if you're Manchester City, if you qualify for the Champions League or not at the end of the year, or any club, you have the difference of about 20 million euros or pounds. More so. That's obviously insane. So you're very incentivized to make sure your team wins. If you're an entity whose sporting results don't impact much your financial results, so for instance, for F1, if it's Mercedes, Ferrari, or Red Bull, it doesn't really impact much for us. Technically, it doesn't change our contracts or revenue or anything. So that obviously our focus is more towards the business side. And then you have the entities that are in between both. If you're a football club, you may also want to decorrelate your financial results from your sporting results, because there's lots of variance in the results, and you may not control everything, especially in sports like football, where you don't score that many goals. It's not always the best team that wins. And that's why you have the likes of XG, expected goals, like Twitter accounts and so on. It's obviously very interesting to follow to see who is overperforming and underperforming based on the data. And so, but at core, on the sports side, the truth is we actually don't know who is doing what, because it's so key and so crucial that they stay very secretive. So I can tell you if they're very advanced or not. I can tell you that in F1, they're amazing at the sports analytics, because they have a wealth of breadth and data and the technology and everything behind this. Across this, it's very hard to say. I'd say the US is usually a bit more advanced, especially when it comes to baseball.
Yeah.
NFL is more late adopter. And in Europe, I think football, the likes of the big clubs, I'm sure, are very good, and the others are quite lagging behind. But you have some clubs that are like popping around, like Brentford in the UK has been very popularized with the use of data from a sports perspective. When it comes to business analytics, it's quite very immature and it's very much the beginning. Some entities have been doing it for a couple of years, but it's quite the window of opportunity is quite wide open, to be honest. It's not the likes of banking or the industries that have been doing this for like 20 plus years. In sports, it's quite very immature, and we are very much at the beginning of it still.
Great. Well, let's talk about that a little bit then. So, obviously, you've been at Formula One for a few years. It'd be great to hear about the journey that you've been on, where you started, and sort of how you got to the point you're at now. It'd be brilliant to hear a little bit about that, please.
So, funny enough, when I started back in the days, there was actually nothing, which
Right.
that's not quite very surprising. But there was, no, actually, that's not true. There were two pieces of information. I could call data set, but that's a bit of a stretch. There were some TV informations, which, to be honest, it was literally an Excel pasted into a Word, and we had like a basically a folder with like Word documents with Excel pasted into it. It was obviously quite painful to use. And there was one other, which was a PDF, not even anything you can use straight away, which is again table pasting and saving PDF about partners exposure. And that was it.
Right.
And there was no understanding whatsoever, no analysis, no insights, no research, not even like super advanced data about who the fans are, what they want, how we're going to get the next 100 million fans, and all these things. So that's kind of the things we had to start from the get go. There was actually a good explanation for this, is because F1 is B2B at core. And the idea was it's the partners that are making the marketing for F1 and they're like developing the brand. And so we let them understand our fans better.
Mm.
But now, since we're going through that direct to consumer journey and getting to know them, the fans, and understand what they want and trying to serve them in all the different variety of fans we might have, which might be difficult,
Yeah.
this is becoming more important. So we had to literally starting from scratch, starting a fan database, starting communicating with the fans. We're not sending any email to anyone.
Right.
From F1, lots of different entities were communicating with the fans. The circuits, the promoters setting tickets, we're having great connection with the fans and so on and so forth. But F1 as an entity, we didn't have that connection. So we had to build from scratch from a technology perspective, from obviously a tools perspective. Internally, the way we work, we're quite very lean, which means that we use tons of different suppliers and different help across the board to help us and everything we do, which I think is obviously is great, because we can always pick and choose whoever is the best at what we need to do based on the different data analytical tools we might need.
Mm.
And if it's too strategic and we want to keep it in-house, we have the ability, we have a couple of people, but we're quite super lean in terms of team.
Right. And it's quite interesting then on that journey. So I think about the data value chain of collection through to execution and insight and value at the other end. It seems like in order to drive some real value, it's about understanding fans, and then you drive that back in to drive your promotions, your sponsorship, the rights, the aggregator stuff that you do. So you had to start this journey in collection, really. You had to kind of start at that early stage of data capture, really, in terms of missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle, really, for driving all the other things. So was that part of your remit, was to help drive the collection as well as the sort of the sort of bringing together and aggregation and insight?
Yes, 100%. Being able to collect this data, being able to adapt the journeys, understand who our fan base are, how our now database works, what are the different clustering segmentations, again, for people browsing the website or the app, how do they use our website and app? What are they doing? What do they need to do more? What do they want more? What content do they want to read? What content do they want to watch? Same across social media. So there's a lot for us to do. I think on that end also it's interesting to differentiate the B2B aspect of F1 and the direct to consumer. So obviously the fan side is absolutely key when it comes to direct to consumer, because these are the people you're talking to.
Yeah.
But you can also leverage that information from B2B perspective, helping make better decisions when it comes to, I don't know, sponsorship, broadcasting rights, and trying to steer the ship in that end as well. So obviously benefits across the board as well.
Yeah, I guess having good understanding of the fan helps drive the conversation with existing partners through sponsorship, and if you're trying to drive, it might highlight that there's a different fan that you didn't quite understand, that therefore there's some different partnership and sponsorship opportunities. So it kind of helps develop what you've already got through the B2B lens with a new data set, which is which is the fans.
100%.
But also, I guess, obviously helps, data about fans helps you drive better engagement with them as well. Is there a difference between, I'm just kind of thinking about, customers, fans, consumers, clients, are there different definitions of who engage, your stakeholders, who engages with you, and do you treat them differently in the way that you capture and analyze information about them?
This is absolutely key, and I think that's also one of the big debate that we see for the past few years in the media as well. Is no fan wants to be treated as a customer, and that's absolutely understandable, and that's very key to understand these differences. And I'm glad you asked the question, because for me, a customer is someone you have a transactional relationship with, so they're buying a service or a product from you, and they expect some things from it. But we have tons and tons of fans that may not be customers, they may not buy anything from us, and actually the vast majority of the people we have connection with within a database, we actually don't have any transactional connection with them. They want to receive our emails, they want to play the free fantasy game, they want to watch videos and get the content and read the content, which is all free, and that's it. And there's no ambitions for them to become customers. That's absolutely fine. It's still very important for us to connect with them, understand who they are, what they want, because we have all that B2B aspect of it. And a fan is a fan who is still just watching social media content and everything else.
Yeah.
It's still kind of generating revenue in a sense. That's the fandom. But also you have consumers, who people that consume our content, but again, may not pay for it, and the customers. I think it's important to say that there's no ambition to try and make all the fans customers, because that's what annoy people, and understandably so. If my favorite team starts treating me like a customer and trying to sell me everything all together, I'll be quite annoyed, because I love the team for the team and I'm enjoying the content and everything else. And there's such an emotional aspect, and that's across sports. It's very key to understand. That's why I think sometimes the way we see this, I guess, in Europe is maybe some kind of different with the US. With the US is more accepted to be treated as a customer. Like you have some teams moving markets because they want to get the stadium funded. That obviously I hope so. That would never happen in Europe, and that's because there's so much an emotional connection to it that we don't even think about it. But imagine if Real Madrid just goes to Valencia because Madrid doesn't want to pay for a stadium, something that'd be crazy.
Yeah, big deal. Yeah, I mean, we saw that with the Super League when it becomes too much about business, too much about driving transactional behavior, too much about that kind of money making part of it. It's a really fine balance, I think. I mean, do you as an organization, obviously, I guess as a fan of Formula One, and I don't really know where I sit on this actually, but I sort of mentioned this at the start. You might be a fan of a team or a driver, and that's who you support rather than supporting Formula One. They sort of, that team and driver happen to sort of play a part in Formula One. Do you get to unpick some of that a bit, and do you get a either data or some insight, qualitative or quantitative, from the clubs themselves?
So funny enough, when it comes to this, having worked in football before, F1 is actually way less tribal than football. Right. Giving you a few examples, from a very mere survey results perspective, when you ask what's the favorite team is to all the F1 fans, the number one answer is, I don't have a favorite team, unless you're Italian, which there's a different team on top. Right. Across the board, there's no favorite. That's the number one answer. It's not like by a massive margin, but that's the number one answer.
Interesting.
And also if you go to a race, you can see a lot of people that might have a McLaren cap and a Mercedes top and some other things, and try and go to a football game and try and find someone who has gears from both, other than like the scarf for like half of it in one team and half of the other. This just never happens. So it's way less trouble within F1, and actually it's more the opposite. More people like the sport for the sports itself. They may have connection with drivers, absolutely, that their favorite drivers, and connection with some teams. And you actually see this moving from team to team when some drivers move around, depending on how successful they are. Lewis being obviously a massive example of how famous he is and how successful he is. But from a fandom perspective, it's actually way less so in F1 than it is in football, where football is more about the connection and the link you make within your early years, actually. And so they have different ways and pathways to become a football fan, but most likely is because of whoever your parents are and who they're supporting, or within your close circle when you're very young. And actually, more funny enough, it's about who was successful as a team when you were a kid. Actually, you can fairly accurately guess someone's favorite team, other than who they
local. Yeah,
exactly, who's the local team, based on who was famous at the time when they were young.
Yeah. From a data perspective, does that give some challenges? Because really, then the job, I guess, is branding and understanding brand and fan engagement with the brand, rather than quite so much on the traditional, I suppose, D2C kind of retail, buying things, interacting with things. It's content, it's brand, rather than. So does that give some different data challenges?
Absolutely, it's not that easy to collect fan data. You have to provide a valuable service for them to be able to give away the data, which is totally understandable.
And it's an exchange, isn't it? The sort of the expectation level of free content is quite high, and the return for giving away your data or buying something is quite high. You have to be quite a sort of high up the value chain to interact in that way.
Absolutely. I think everyone within the sports environment is doing lots of research to try to understand, okay, what makes someone give their email address and willingly, obviously, opt in to get a newsletter, because that's socially very important. They have to understand what they're going to get. They have to like the content and engage with it. And that's absolutely key. And I think that's across the board as well. And that's why the content is the key piece of information. And as a rights holder, is very important for us. And that's why if you scroll long enough in our Instagram and social media, you're going to see a big difference before 2017 and after. Because one of the first things that Liberty, or like the new ownership, did when getting into F1 is allowing the teams to post some F1 content, which, funny enough, the teams and the drivers were not allowed to post anything related to F1, because that was so key and that was kind of the crown jewel. They didn't want to give it for free. But obviously, there were some valid reasons for it at the time. But in this day and age, if you don't post on social media, you just don't exist.
Well, and it also opens up the connection with the fans. I've seen this in soccer, actually, in football, that the fact that clubs are opening up way more than they used to. It used to all be behind a paywall, but now much more about what's happening inside the clubs, inside the sports, inside the teams is opened up, so that you can engage more than just reading the back pages of the paper at the end of each day.
Yeah, I mean, the behind the scenes content is really what's the crunch on what everyone wants to see, and that's why the likes of Netflix Drive to Survive has been an immense and huge success across the globe, because it gives you a glimpse as to what's happening behind, what's happening under the helmet, and what all the different tractations and discussions and talks, and when drivers change teams and engine manufacturers and all these things, and it's just fascinating.
What are some of the challenges you've had then with making that successful in your time at Formula One?
I'll give you two examples. One of them would be when we first launched our OTT product back in May 2018. I think it just comes to launching a product and obviously having difficulties with it, like behind the scenes that people don't see. For instance, we lost a few months worth of data because we didn't wire the data correctly on the back end, which means that we had all the consumption data, funny enough. So we knew exactly what everyone was watching, how long, and everything else. But the key to connect that key information to the so-and-so Max Métral email address, first name, last name, and so on, was just not matching. Right. So it took us first a few weeks to understand, wow, this is not working, and then a few more weeks to try and fix it. So we lost a couple of months of data. So that was obviously very frustrating, because when you launch a service, you want to make sure you understand who's doing what, and you want to retarget people accordingly and use that information for churn prediction and all these things. That was quite frustrating. Took us some time to get it right. The second one I would say is just something totally out of my hands, but Netflix Drive to Survive series is so successful and everyone talks about it. But from a data perspective, I get absolutely no view into who's watching it. And that's obviously just from a privacy policy and very understandably so. But in an ideal world, I'd love to have the name and contact details of everyone watching and enjoying the show. And it's just very, very difficult to have some kind of data collection on the back of it. And even from a very simplistic vision of measuring the impact, we can do lots of research and there's lots of ways to collect information, but it's never very comprehensive as to how the breadth and depth of it, and how can you efficiently see, ideally you want to do an A/B testing, someone who has watched the show, someone who hasn't, and as this person on the very, obviously doing the statistical test around it, does it make people watch more F1 on TV, or does it make, and that's just very hard for us to do at the moment because of the way it is. We know it's working, but it's very hard to track exactly the results of it.
Yes, and whether you should invest in something like that, whether you should do something like that, engage with more content like that, or whether you stick to where you are.
Exactly.
So that challenge was kind of lack of access to a data set that would be really insightful for you.
Exactly. I don't think we can change anything with it, but we know it's working. I know it's working. Everyone tell me about it. And I go with my friends and friends of friends, like, oh, I started watching Formula One because I watched the Netflix series. But from a data perspective, we also have lots of surveys and research and so on, but that's not as accurate as like a fully comprehensive data analytical study.
What are some of your favorite kind of insights or use cases that you've worked on since being there that have sort of really added some value to Formula One?
We did a couple of things. One of the things that we're doing at the moment, and we started last year because that was very crucial with the pandemic and the difficulty in organizing a season, and obviously the fact that we had no idea what we'd race on first. And then when we started putting the calendar together, we're just adding Grand Prix as we went. And so that was quite challenging. And also from a sponsorship perspective, obviously, we have to deliver rights and make sure our partners are visible on screen and offer them a wide quality of content. And starting the season, obviously, during the pandemic, it's like, okay, how are we going to do this? We don't even know where we're going to race. Some tracks we just have never been at, Portimao in Portugal and others. So we had actually no even data to back it up as to how much exposure you can generate from it. So when I mean exposure, I mean seconds on screen for partners to be visible.
Right.
So we work with a company called Flamingo and doing some computer vision to analyze the logos on screen when they did it for us, and using logos on screen and for us to be able to better optimize our trackside signage, given that we want to do it in a very specific way. The way, if you watch F1, of people listening and watching F1, they're going to realize that you have a subsequent set of corners with a single brand, and in order for it to look good and being able to give everyone their own ownership around the track. And there's always ways you can make it better. And also one of the challenges at the time is not only doing it better and more efficient, but one of the things was because of the pandemic, because of the health and safety protocols and so on, we reduced everyone traveling to the race. So we had to reduce also the number of cameras. So for an example, if I remember well, from Austria, which was the first Grand Prix of the 2020 season, I think we had 18 cameras, and the year before we had 25. It's quite a drastic change. So we had to make this change for first the fans not to see it on TV, that they don't perceive that there's any difference in the quality of the feed, but also from a partner perspective, if you delete the camera that was just in front of all the Rolex branding, well, that means that Rolex is invisible now to the TV viewership. So kind of doing all this analysis and so on, that was quite interesting because we see lots of time pressure to do this last year, and it was just very exciting to do so. And obviously we're doing the next iterations now because as you train the model, we're training for more the sponsors now as well, and you're trying to train for different variations of the logos as well. And obviously F1 being a very fast sport, the cameras are moving quite fast. So you need to train it, but not too well, because you also want it to mimic the human eye. So you don't want the computer to see logos that the eye doesn't see. And so that's also something that's interesting to do, and also challenging. And also as we have to retrain the model as well, we're also trying to differentiate now. We have some on-screen graphics, which is basically all the animations that you add onto the feed. So you have what's on the track and you have what you add on it. And we're training the model to differentiate these type of logos as well, because sometimes they look very good. So you think it's there when it's not. So also that's one of the things that we're doing right now, is just adds more complexity to the model, but that's what very exciting and challenging.
Yeah, fantastic. How as a team are you set up then to deliver on this? I think you mentioned you're a sort of relatively lean business, and you know you use partners, but how are you set up, I guess, functionally, rather than specific names of partners or team members or anything, but just data engineering, analytics, data science, AI. How does that work for you?
Yeah, so our whole data pipeline, let's say, in terms of on the fan related side, on the direct to consumer, we outsource this. So we have partners that help us just collect all the data, putting into single shape or form, and dedupe all the different identification, then they push it back into within our environment. And then we have a couple of people that if need be, we can do analysis ourselves, models and so on and so forth. Right. But then we also have different entity and different partners helping us on all the CRM side, all the communication bits and so on and so forth. Obviously, the F1 TV bits, the OTT is also slightly different bits as well. So we have a wealth and breadth of partners helping us in a whole different variety of subjects. On the OTT side, it's obviously about acquisition and retention. So having a churn model in place, churn prevention model, what can we do about it? What drives people to churn, not renew the membership? What can we do about it? And how to get even better at doing all this. So but wealth and breadth. And the way we do this is every time we have a problem we're trying to solve, we're trying to ask ourselves, can we do it ourselves? Is it worth our time? And are we the best to do it? So for instance, when it comes to the project I mentioned about computer vision, this is a bit more advanced than what we used to do. And you have to develop a machine and make it work. And it's like, there's no need in us spending 3-4 months working on this exclusively and then having to update it and keeping in shape and everything else. So it's like, let's find whoever is the best partner to work with that we trust and that can work on this with us. Because also one of the difficulties when it started, we had no idea where we land. We had no idea if it would work. So that's what you need to have someone you trust and being agile in the way you do your sprints and the way you develop the tool and the products. So that's obviously super important for us as well, in finding the right people to work with.
Yeah. And do you drive the sort of prioritization of what you work on through some kind of mechanism, and are you tracking kind of return and the benefit that you achieve through that? And does that feed your kind of investment case going forward?
So two different questions. The way prioritization is made is literally talking to all the directors and seeing what all their needs, what can we do about it, and literally me assessing is like, okay, I think we can add a lot of value on this. This is a bit more marginal, so it may be more on the back end. That's one thing. Okay. On the ROI, this is actually a super difficult question, and talking to all my peers within the sports industry, everyone does it a bit differently. I've given up on trying to put a dollar value in everything I do, because it's just too complex and it actually ends up quite subjective at the end of the day. So you need people to trust what value you're getting at with the numbers you're crunching. And I think it's just being too difficult to argue most of the time, because some of it is quite easy to do when it comes to churn and direct consumer and direct monetization. It's quite easy to have dollar value, so we still do that. But some of the projects that are more B2B, it's just much harder. If, for instance, we did a project where we help our TV rights team better price our assets. So better understand when it comes to if you sell rights in a given market, did you sell it for a good price or not? Because there's lots of different variables. It's not just about how many zeros you have at the end of the check. It's also what do you think it's worth? If you think it's worth 10 million and you sell it for 9, where you -1. But the other way around, if you sell it for 10, but you think it's worth 7, then you've done a good job, and there might be a lot of reasons for it. But when it comes to this, let's say you do this project and you end up with a quite accurate valuation and so on. Can you take credit out of the money that whoever is doing the negotiation is end up making? Because I'm not the one making the negotiation. So that's where it becomes quite subjective to try and put a value on it. And that's where it's hard to argue, to be honest. It's more, my view is trying to make sure everyone is happy with what we do. We're trying to make sure we help all the directors and the key stakeholders make the decisions and that they feel that we're helping them. I think that's the key value that I'm trying to unlock. And obviously, putting dollar values in terms for everything related to direct consumer, because it's easier to do, but most of the time is actually quite hard to measure all the impact you're doing. It's actually easier to do what you think is the right thing and implement the right tool and the right algorithm and everything else, rather than spending years and years and years trying to find the ROI of what you're doing.
Yeah, I guess as you say, it's there's a bit of a combination of trust and openness and honesty and just working together on this. Where actually it's a kind of brand engagement, longer term, you're sort of a few steps removed from the end result, versus where you're, as you say, direct to consumer. You can see how many customers you're acquiring, you can see how many are renewing, you can see how many are viewing and how long they're watching for. And so I can see why you've got some different approaches and methods depending on what the use case is. So look, I want to wrap up. I got one final question for you, So the phrase, there's some phrases that the industry use about what you're trying to do, which is kind of, there's one that I use, which is kind of data guided, create organizations that are guided by data. I kind of, the data driven one is an interesting one that some people like, some people hate. You're in Formula One, it's all about driving cars. Is that one you use? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you use something else?
Yeah, I think on the sports side, I think that's what they do. On the business side, personally, I really don't like it. I think it's actually quite dangerous to be data driven. Again, taking it to the letter, I'd rather be data informed. And I think that's what the way we're trying to do things at F1 is. My vision and what we're doing at F1 is every piece of information and insights every piece of insight is a piece of information that you use when making decisions. but it doesn't mean that you should disregard your gut instinct, which for me is also another piece of information that needs to be used. Experience, breadth of experience, and I actually have a very good example for it. When we started Draft to Survive, as strange as it might seem now, it was just very much a big bet because this was something that's never been done before. There was before some documentaries following a single team, but there's never been any documentary and behind the scenes content following a sport and every team all together at the same time. And that's quite revolutionary. And so there's literally the vision of at the time our commercial director Sean Bratches and our head of TV rights Ian Holmes, and they were like, yeah, this is what we need to do. And they had to hold the negotiation and push behind the scenes all this, but there's absolutely no data whatsoever to try and prove what was right or what if it wasn't right, and what would be the interest and the perception. And right now, when you ask people on the streets, do they know F1? The first thing they tell you is Netflix. It's obviously an insane success, but there's no data to back it up. And if you were strictly applying the data-driven thing, would we have done it at the time? I don't know. We're just thinking of this, and so that's one of the examples. But another one would be there are lots of examples where if you follow the data strictly, you might make mistakes. And obviously, right now with a pandemic and every historically driven database, everyone looking at 2020 having issues with the data and the models and trying to update everything. So it's very difficult. So that's one of the reasons why is your sample size might not be big enough. You might be not representative. You might have noise that you're interpreting for signal, and that's also quite difficult. And also you have human error. Every piece of information, every piece of algorithm has been made by a human that might make mistakes somewhere or another. That's why it's always good to apply some critical thinking, in my opinion, and use it as an insight that you use in your decision making. Which doesn't mean that we never follow the data. It just means that trying to make sure that we second guess everything we do, even in terms of data, which some people might think this is data, this is true. Take it for face value.
Yeah. Great. Well, for the same reasons we use data guided, you explain the reasons you use data informed. So, but kind of disappointed that analogy of data driven isn't used. But there we go. What can we do?
I know.
So, listen, thanks so much, Max. It's been great talking to you. Lovely insight into Formula One, the world of Formula One, how you work, how you operate, the data that you're using, and how you're using it to dial up the use of insights and deliver some value. So, absolutely brilliant to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason.
No problem. And thanks everyone for listening. We hope you enjoyed that, and we'll catch you next time.